Okay, so the martial arts component, and by that I mean the fighting and self-defense component. If you want to see some of the more functional applications for a little bit of the Shaolin system, check out one of my last videos. Um, I forgot what it was called, but Northern Shaolin is in the title. It should be 2 videos down. Um, it is a good system in theory, I think. It's a defensive system. It has good kicks. It has decent defensive techniques, I would say. Not the best in my opinion, but conceptually they're not bad. And a lot of it to me is just over exaggerations or just outdated. Maybe like they wouldn't work against someone that's not a traditional kung fu person. And what I mean by that is like the importance that they placed on certain things just makes no sense, or some of it just sounds like fantasy, at least the way that I was taught. So, for example, I have this movement, right? They say to keep the arm under the armpit because there are pressure points in this region that, if struck properly, can do some serious damage to your organs or whatever. I don't know if that's true or not, but I don't know that, even in like a normal like guard position, right? If I'm here, my armpits are covered. If I'm punching, this is a tough area to get into, even if I reach this way. But more importantly, I'm not going to do this and just hold it here and wait for somebody to tickle my underarm, right? You're going to go here. If I'm throwing straight, yes, it's going to have power. It's going to be out here for a little bit longer than usual, but it's not going to stay there enough to where someone can, do whatever nonsense that's about. And this is not just that movement. There are a couple of other movements, like this one, where they're like, ah, yes, keep your hand here to block the pressure points down in this general region. And then they do the underarm thing again later, and it's just like, I see the theme here. I understand that you're worried about someone, doing some chinking fist on your pressure points. But, yeah, the Kill Bill moves don't really work in real life. And then there are other movements, and here's a clip of this one that I cannot stand this movement. That is useless, right? It serves no clear function. And if it does have an application, it's clearly going to have to be super abstract. Um, but to be fair, though, it does hint towards the development of agility and flexibility and all that stuff, because all that stuff is required to complete this movement in a aesthetically pleasing way. But for self-defense, but for fighting, it serves no purpose. And then the movements that are theatrical, or at least have theatrical explanations. In an elementary Nolan Shaolin form, Lian Buchuan, or in Cantonese Limbo Kun, this movement here at the very beginning, right? There's a couple variations to it. That's the variation that I learned. I was told that this is going up under somebody's jaw, pressing somewhere back here, so apparently it's going to force them to open up, pressing your thumb down on their tongue, and then ripping their jaw out. I do I need to say more? Um, when I was a 12-year-old kid learning this, maybe 13, it sounded cool. And I was like, man, I would always wonder if it were possible if somebody could do it. And now the older I get, the more I'm realizing that that's just fantasy. It's just, maybe it's possible if you're a 300-pound massive muscle against a 5'4" skin and bone type person, maybe. But the average person, or even someone like myself who's been training for 13 years or so, I wouldn't consider myself capable of doing that. Even back when I was training religiously, there was a point in time where I was training 7 days a week for a couple of hours a day. I still would not feel confident in saying like, yes, I can clearly rip somebody's jaw off from their face. So the whole pressure point ordeal, the opening of Shaolin 4, you open, you come in with your hands like you're like serving a platter basically. They said that this is to go into the armpit here and, strike those pressure points of sorts. And again, maybe y'all were taught something different. personally, I could see a whole bunch of different applications for some simple movement like this, but this is what was explained to me. Do I agree with it? Absolutely not. But it's just like, this was the bizarre stuff that I was shared, and it doesn't work. I don't see the use in teaching. I don't see the use in practicing that way. So why do it, right? So outside of theatrics, outside of movements that don't serve a clear function, they still require a significant amount of modification. And, like when we do like the grab punch, it's like, I like the concept there, but if someone's punching, I'm not going to grab, like, I'm not going to extend my arm all the way out like that. It's just not safe. It doesn't make sense to do. When I can just cover or block this way, grab and pull in a safer way. And you could say, oh yeah, but that's the case for like every Kung Fu style. No, it's not. Wing Chun does not require a significant amount of modification. It requires a significant amount of understanding, but a lot of it is pretty straightforward. I mean, how many different ways can you explain this, right? Someone throws, I'm blocking and I'm punching, or I move out the way, I block and I punch. Maybe you add or tweak a little something, but the general idea is still the same, whether you do it in like Wing Chun pose or you do it in a more like modern however you want to do it. But you look at Hung Gar, a movement like this, it more or less the same. Somebody punches, you block, you strike. There's definitely better ways to do it, I think, but the concept stays the same. And the idea of, right, someone throws, I move out the way, I block, I strike, stays the same. Do I get in such a long stance? No. Do I reach all the way? No. But the idea of stepping it, block, strike is the same. It's not like a movement like this, right? That movement doesn't make any sense as it is. It is a takedown, right? You're coming in and throwing somebody this way, but using the movement this way, right, with this little flick of that wrist and all that stuff, it doesn't emulate the function of the technique. Or even like the intro to Shaolin 6, right? You have all of this. Why is this hand still out in the back? I say, oh, it's pulling in something, but I just punched here. So the sequence itself might not make sense. And there's a lot of ways to make it make sense. You say, it's just pulling something in, right? So you mean something comes in, I check, maybe I grab it, and then punch, which is the same thing as this, but it has to be so significantly modified to make it make sense. This movement, right? The idea is somebody grabs, I cut it off, I take your arm, and I twist it. That looks nothing like this, and it doesn't feel like it either. If it felt like it, that's a different story, but it doesn't really emulate how it's used, right? Because and again, I don't necessarily agree with this in a fighting space, but if I'm hanging out and somebody decides to grab me, which I don't think anybody would grab me that way, but in the weird event that they did, this requires waist movement, right? Because if they're stronger, my arm strength might not be able to handle it. So waist movement. Then I'm not going to do such a big circle, right? If I've already cleared them, I'll go straight forward. I'm going to pull them in, right? I'm not going to do this dramatic circle. I'm going to pull in and then twist and lock up their arm. So it's like, you can make modifications, which I've seen, where, you might do this and go straight here, which is a lot more reminiscent of how the technique is supposed to be used, or they'll change it altogether, where they'll block something and then go for the grab. But you have to be realistic about what it is that you're doing. And this is why I'm partial to doing this way, because I don't like blocking kicks like this. There's a whole other reason for it, but it's just like, if it's not straightforward and simple, it's very challenging to dissect. And a lot of it is super circular movement, right? We have like all of these kinds of movements. These kinds of movements that are pretty and they look good, but the function is not clear. The punches are actually pretty decent because they're all the same, right? Like we just discussed. This movement here schwa is used the same as, grab, punch, or however you want to look at that. And then we also have, strikes like this, where that can easily be somebody throws, you cover under, and then counter that. A lot of it is in this like realm of deceit, where the old masters made a conscientious decision to conceal the application of the movement. And I think that worked to the system's deficit, and we can kind of see how that panned out when you look at how Kung Fu people are fighting today, right? It's a joke, really. No one knows what they're doing, or when they try to, they just look awkward and silly. And, this is coming from somebody who doesn't claim to be a great fighter. Do I understand how to use my techniques? Sure. Have I practiced them with partners with live resistance enough to be able to say, like, yes, I know I'm a great fighter and I could probably last a few rounds in the ring? No, I'm not going to say that either. For me personally, I care more about the self-defense component, and that does involve some sparring, that does involve learning how to use my techniques, but I don't need to have the capacity to go 3 rounds in an MMA ring, I don't need to have the capacity. I don't remember how many rounds it is in a boxing match, Understanding why we do what we do, understanding what we do was made challenging intentionally, and we can see the results of that. But I'm here to kind of try and break down some of that and try to shine some light on the reality of what this practice has to offer. And if I'm being very honest, I don't think that this system is bad for self-defense. I don't think that this system is bad for fighting. I don't like it because it's just not my preference. But it is a good system. It has some good techniques. It has very basic, simple, and straightforward techniques that I think a lot of people could benefit from. Especially those of us outside the realm of Kung Fu, I'd say jiu-jitsu players or wrestlers and things like that, because they tend to be like stocky and strong and have all this power, but they don't have the same agility. They don't have great flexibility. And I can't speak for everybody, but from the few people that I've seen, they generally seem to be lacking in those areas. And I think they could really benefit from a system like this, where you get to learn haiku, you get to learn some simple striking. And on the flip side, we could definitely benefit from them, right? Because Shaolin has like 2 ground fighting techniques, and they're not great. It's just like pendulum sweeps and a little side kick on the floor. Yay. It's not great techniques. It's simple techniques. It's kind of, to me, like oh shit movements where, I get knocked down, I got a kick to create some distance. Maybe I roll back after that so that I can react and then get up or find something like that. It's like a preemptive technique so that I can get off the floor, as opposed to fighting on the floor, which personally I agree with and prefer. But if we're talking sports, then I do need to learn how to handle myself on the floor. Even if I'm talking self-defense, it's good to know how to handle yourself on the floor, and you're not going to get that from a Kung Fu style. And it's sad to say, because all of that stuff, the ground fighting in Jiu-Jitsu, originates from Chinese martial arts, but it's all been lost in translation. And you can find books about some of the techniques. It's just isolated techniques and how to get to them, none of which are explained in the context of form, which means that a lot of these guys, they either know the forms and don't know how to do the techniques, or know the techniques and don't have any forms, which is fine. But for a traditional practitioner like myself, I would like to have both. Sometimes you see these movements that are like stupid strikes that don't make any sense because, the way your teacher decided to teach it to you, maybe that's the way they were taught, or maybe that's what they came up with because they just need to come up with something and didn't want students to come out feeling empty-handed. But it's like, if a strike doesn't make sense, it's usually a throw or a hip toss or a sweep of sorts, in Kung Fu specifically. And, like this movement here, going under, now that to me is like a setup for like a fireman carry or something. So you really have to look at the movements and do your best to interpret them realistically. We shouldn't have to decipher all of this, right? If somebody's coming to learn martial arts, they shouldn't have to solve a puzzle. I personally find it engaging and entertaining, but it is also just as frustrating because it's like, why the hell wasn't I taught this myself? You know, why didn't my teachers teach it to me? And odds are it's because they didn't know or because they were told not to. And I ran into that a lot, and I'll get more into that experience next week. But for right now, let's recap what we've covered. So we talked about the benefits of the Northern Shaolin system. We discussed some of the pros and cons of its fighting techniques and a little bit about why the system is the way it is and how that worked to its deficit. And we also discussed that Shaolin is good for agility, kicking techniques, flexibility, cardio, and mental health. And I hope you all learned something. I hope you all found value in our conversation. I hope you all, if you're from the Northern Shaolin style, if you are taking issue with my critique of the system, that's okay. But I challenge you to ask yourself, why are you offended? Are you offended because I am critiquing something that's ancient and traditional and, oh, you shouldn't critique the old masters? Or are you upset because I said something wrong, right? Am I upsetting you because you don't like my opinion? And that's fine too. You don't have to agree with my opinion. But I would like for you to really look inward and think, am I upset because he's challenging what I was conditioned to believe? Because I used to run into that myself. And again, I'll get more into my history next week. But just for the sake of this part of the conversation, I used to be very defensive of my style. I used to be one of those people that was like, yeah, MMA is bullshit. How come they throw 50 punches to somebody's face and they don't get knocked down? With a kung fu person, that's our theory and blah, blah, blah. And I think that's just it, right? All of it is theory. We all have a lot of knowledge and we can talk out of our ass and we can talk about, oh, this person did this against this person and blah, blah, blah. And we're talking about kung fu against kung fu, but kung fu against reality? I've seen it. It can work. I felt it. But the way that I was taught, the old way, the traditional way, is just as good as it is bad. There's a lot of bad that comes with it. There's a lot of good that comes with it. And you have to be able to suss out both. You can't live in this fantasy world and believe that because this practice has been alive for 1,000+ years, it's phenomenal. You have to realize that every system is flawed. MMA is flawed. Well, okay, I can't really say MMA is flawed because MMA is not a fixed martial art. But, karate, taekwondo, jiu-jitsu, kung fu, and any kung fu style is flawed inherently because humans are flawed creatures. We can't perfect everything. I'm going to teach Hung Gar my way. And that means I'm going to adapt to my students' needs. That means I'm going to adapt to what's communicated to me, what I'm failing at, and what I'm succeeding at. And I'm going to meet my students where they are. I'm not going to teach them the old way when the old way won't work for them. If it does, I'll teach it that way. But I had to find my own way. And I think that's the beauty of mixed martial arts, is that it gives you that freedom to find your own way. And that's actually one of my favorite sayings, is you need to learn the way of finding your own way. We can't live in rigidity as life and as in martial arts, We've seen it a couple of times where these kung fu masters with millions of years of not millions of years, but a couple dozen years of experience get beat up by somebody that's been doing MMA for a few months. What's that say, right? We are amassing knowledge. We're amassing all of this content, but we don't have the ability to use it. So what's the point? Internal development, blah, blah, blah. Yes, that's beautiful. Please continue your internal journey, but don't claim to be fighters. Don't claim to be able to know how to use your technique. They're two separate entities. This is a little bit of a segue, but it's also going to give you light as to what I'm going to be talking about next week. Next week, I'm going to go into my history and talk to you about what it's like to have been a part of a kung fu cult. And I know that sounds corny and stupid, and it probably doesn't sound like that's a thing, but martial arts cults are very much a thing. And when you've been studying since the age of like 11, it has a profound impact on you. It is traumatizing. And it's going to be hard to go back into all of that stuff, but I feel like I have a responsibility to share my story with the world so that people can look inward and look outward and see what their schools, what their studios are doing. Look at how the children you've enrolled in your practice are being treated and draw conclusions and make a decision that's best for you. So with that said, I hope you've learned something. I hope that I have been able to give you a new perspective on this system, or at least a refresher of a perspective on this system. I hope that you can take everything with a grain of salt and find similar conclusions or different conclusions for yourself and find what works for you. So you all, I'll see you in the new year. Happy New Year. You all take care. See you next time.